Hello, and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Wehry, and I'm here today with Dr. Gray Sutanto, Assistant Professor of Systematic Theology at Reformed Theological Seminary. And we're talking about the book that he edited and annotated with Dr. Corey Brock called Philosophy of Revelation. And it's by Herman Bavinck. It's a series of lectures, I think started with the Stone Lectures at Princeton. Dr. Sutanto, wonderful to have you on today.
Thanks for having me on.
So first and foremost, why this book? You know, I see like the original, I think the original translation is 1909, and you felt like it was time for an update. Why is Bavinck important? Why is this particular series of lectures important?
Yeah, I think it's probably no understatement to say that this is probably the most significant Bavinck text, or at least the most mature, the most substantive, at least as a standalone text. I know when we talk about Herman Bavinck, we'll talk about the 4-volume Reformed Dogmatics, which came out in the English translation between 2003 to 2008. And of course, that's his magnum opus. I mean, he covered every systematic theological loci in that particular work, all the way from prolegomena or first things to eschatology. But with respect to his standalone single work, Philosophy of Revelation marks his most mature development as a thinker, and it really presents his emphasis later in his life. This is 1908, so this is later in his life. He died in 1921. On the inescapability of Christian revelation in all philosophical knowing. So we see in this project really the emphases that we've already found in the Reformed Dogmatics really culminate in this particular project. It's trying to make a case for this inescapability thesis, we'll try to call it for now. So when we were doing our doctoral work together, Corey Brock and I, and the University of Edinburgh, we were constantly wrestling with this particular text, and we were thinking about how significant it was, but also how difficult it was. And even now, you know, we just covered this text with a class that I teach here at Reformed Theological Seminary on Bavinck. And we closed the class basically the last 3 weeks on this particular book. And as I was revisiting it again, I was reminded of how difficult it was, and I was still relearning things. He was naming a lot of names that perhaps I had to review on as I had to teach a text to the students. But yeah, it's very rewarding once we see his arguments therein. And, you know, when a lot of Christian apologists or Christian theologians say things like, well, you need revelation, you need the Bible to know things or to know God, oftentimes it's done in a more simplistic way. Like it's used as a weapon. You need a Christian worldview, you need Christian revelation, or else you can't really see anything clearly. And what Bavinck does in this particular work, and it's so exciting and informative and really quite instructive, is that he refuses that deductive approach, that a priori approach. And he argues for it in an inductive fashion. So he goes through, and the reason why it's so difficult is that he goes through all of the scholarly literature that he found in his own day, and he tried to argue from those sources themselves to show that even when they're denying the Christian faith, they're still implicitly standing upon the Christian faith in some way. So instead of showing it, instead of proving it from the outset, he shows it inductively and demonstrates it by looking at these sources very closely. So you got to go through all these texts with him and be patient with it, because he's really only get to his thesis or his conclusions at the very end.
And just for the title, this is really interesting. It's kind of got a polysemic bent to it, that you have the philosophy of revelation in both senses, that it's a revelational philosophy and it's a philosophy of revelation. Can you talk a little bit about how he utilizes both meanings?
Yeah, that's great. So theology, classically speaking, is God and all things in relation to God. And so theology has a sort of vertical dimension, right? You're taking a look at doctrines like theology proper, the doctrine of the Trinity, creation, providence, theological anthropology, and so on. So we're taking a look at God and all of his works. So there's that vertical dimension, but the philosophy of revelation, Bavinck argues in that first chapter, is a kind of horizontalization. It's asking the question of what are the implications of theology or what we learn from revelation to the other disciplines of life. So what are the implications of revelation for, you know, as you cover the different topics in these lectures, for the discipline of history, for the discipline of religious studies, for the discipline of the natural sciences, and how we understand culture, how we understand even the hopes of humanity. what he calls the future, simply revelation and the future, which is really about the eschatological or the utopian hopes of humanity, for instance. So he's trying to say, okay, we have all these resources in theology. Let's take a look at how that bears out in relation to the other fields of life. And that's what he calls the philosophy of revelation. It's really asking the question of how and the why theology matters and how theology plays out in these different fields. That's what he's trying to get at there.
And what does he mean by revelation? Because I was actually surprised. I've been reading Charles Taylor's The Language Animal, and he mentions, he's talking about this idea of different theories of language. And he mentions Haman and Herder. And so now I have them up on my shelf and I haven't read them yet. And then I'm looking through here and I'm like, oh, Bavinck is using Haman and Herder. And I know that there's this anti-enlightenment bent there with the Romantics. So there is like from this time period, you expect a certain modernist definition of revelation, but he obviously has something else in mind.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up. I mean, that's a deep cut with Haman and Herder. Haman particularly is very hard to read because he writes in a almost proverbial fashion with aphorisms and things like that, kind of like isolated statements sometimes. Yeah, so Bavinck refuses to separate what some people might call general and special revelation, or between natural and supernatural revelation. So in classical Christian thinking or Reformed theology, you oftentimes see the distinction between natural revelation on the one hand and supernatural revelation on the other hand. So natural revelation refers to what you can know about God and morality, the soul, the self, and so on from nature alone. So from creation, what can you tell about morality? What can you tell about God from creation alone? Whereas special revelation, or what some other authors call supernatural revelation, is what you can know about God from verbal, biblical revelation. So what God has revealed to us through the apostles and the prophets specifically. Now, all these topics could be deepened and broadened, but basically that's the distinction. And Bavinck refuses to make a strong distinction between the two. He actually argues that this distinction between general and special revelation began at the calling of Abraham. So before Abraham, God was always addressing humanity as a whole. So when he spoke to the original Adamic humanity, for instance, Adam was representing all of humanity. And so when God spoke to him verbally, this was not just special to a specific people, but this was universal. This was creational in a sense. All of creation was addressed by it. So one of the assumptions between, this distinction between general and special revelation is that general revelation is universal, and special revelation, biblical revelation, is specific. Only a few people have access to it in a sense. But before the calling of Abraham, where Abraham was actually separated out from his original community to go on this journey for God and so on, this verbal revelation was given to Adam, was given to Noah, in a way that highlights the representative function to mediate the revelation to the rest of humanity. And so God's verbal revelation back then was a universal creational revelation in a sense. So that's what happened before the call of Abraham. And so Bavinck wants to emphasize that unity between general and special revelation. With that being said, he does focus for the most part in most of these chapters on what we might call general revelation, which anticipates, because of their close unity, special revelation. And there's a pivotal section in chapter 3 specifically where he appeals to St. Augustine. And what he tries to show there is that in St. Augustine's writings, you have this doctrine of illumination, where when you take a look inside one's own consciousness, one's own soul, you'll actually see there not a kind of blank slate, but rather notions or senses of the good and the true and the beautiful. That you'll see traces of God, even traces of the Trinity in one's consciousness. And so he tries to say that Augustine prompts us to turn inward. And by turning inward, we'll actually look upward. In a sense, we'll be in touch with the realm of the good and true and the beautiful. And we'll find that this consciousness of the good and the true and the beautiful is primordial, it is basic, precisely because it was implemented by God himself. It was implanted by God. And what he's going to argue is that this Augustinian turn to the self to turn up is actually complemented by the Romantic tradition that you mentioned. The Romantics argued it is not by reasoning upwards that we see the transcendence, but it's rather by a kind of immediate consciousness of the good and the true and the beautiful. It's immediate contact with it. So we don't have to demonstrate that we know these things. We are already always in contact with it. Friedrich Schleiermacher, the father of modern theology, would argue that we are conscious of these things by way of feeling. Not feeling in the sense of high emotions, but rather we are immediately, directly, always wrestling with the good and true and the beautiful prior to reasoning. And so Bavinck would argue, when you take a look at all these different texts in the 19th century, 20th century that he's dealing with, even by materialists, even by naturalists, even by non-Christians, even when they're saying that all we are just mechanical beings made up of, atoms and physical parts and so on, they're still smuggling in their direct contact with the good and the true and the beautiful. They're making evaluative judgments. They're making adjudications on, here's the dark ages of history, here's the light ages of history, here's the better parts of history, here's the worst parts of history. Now, where do those instincts come in? And if you don't have special revelation come in and say these instincts come from the triune God who forgives us in Jesus Christ, you're going to end up arguing that the good and the true and the beautiful, these instincts that you have, these feelings that you have, are to be identified with something other than God. And that leads to disastrous consequences. So that's his broad argument. So it's this interplay between general and special revelation, this immediate contact with the divine, in a sense, the good and true and the beautiful, and our resistance of identifying those things with God, and our insistence that those things need to be identified with creational things rather than God, which leads to disastrous consequences. And Bavinck's desire to reconnect those immediate feelings to special revelation. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I'm wrestling through that. It makes sense, and I find it valuable. I had come to similar conclusions about the natural supernatural, slightly different, but it was actually from reading Spinoza. And because he talks about, he's like, if it's all God's laws, then he can't, with God acting, can't break those laws. He can't break his own laws. So therefore, everything that happens is natural. Or reading Spinoza's obviously trying to get us to say there's no supernatural, but the other response is to say his argument's right. You could just say it's all supernatural, right? That when God created, like those are his acts, and when he's spoken to history, those are also his acts. There's obviously a unity between those two things at the core of it. But that's slightly different from what Bavinck is saying. Yeah.
Well, it leads into a kind of pantheistic conclusion, right? Because, of course, everything is supernatural if all that we are is merely extensions of the singular infinite substance. But what Bavinck is getting at is that human beings are always in contact with this divinity, the sense of the divine, Calvin would call it, right? But because we repress the truth, we're always going to end up identifying the sense with something else other than the divine. And that leads to, he goes through lots of different examples here, but it leads to a kind of nationalism, he argues. Well, we have the sense of the good and the true and the beautiful, but we refuse to locate that in God. And so we're going to locate that in something other than God, usually is going to be in ourselves. And conveniently, in that time, who are the best German philosophers who were writing on these things? Well, they were normally anti-Christian. And they were saying things like, well, the good and the true and the beautiful are located in our own culture. And then they were projecting themselves as the source of normativity and the source of human hope. And by cutting out the transcendence, all of the hope is this worldly, but it's our culture's representation. And every other culture needs to catch up. And so he was actually looking back now in the 21st century, he was predicting, in a way, the rise of German nationalism and German socialism and so on that came up in the 1940s, of course. But he was writing in 1908, so it's pretty predictive.
Actually, and this comes up. Part of the reason why you updated this is because the original translation didn't note when he used different languages, but he did that quite a bit. So he's writing in Dutch, but he's or this is in Dutch, right?
Yeah.
Or
Dutch.
Yeah. And then he's interjecting German because most of his his dialogue is with the German philosophers.
That's right. Yeah. And sometimes he would use English as well and French and Latin. So we try to really mark that out and just to show the eclecticism of his sources. One more thing to say about
Yeah,
Revelation before I forget
sure.
is, you pulled up the book just now and you can see that it's a nice Mondrian cover.
Yes.
And people are wondering, okay, why do you have a Mondrian cover? What does that have to do with Herman Bavinck? So Robert Cavolo, who's a scholar in Los Angeles, he showed us that actually Mondrian was inspired by what we now know as the neo-Calvinist tradition, which was the tradition that came from Bavinck and Kuyper, this revival of Calvinism for the modern world in 19th century, 20th century, the Netherlands. And so he was inspired by this movement. And what we try to communicate with Mondrian and what Mondrian took from that movement is that the reason why he's emphasizing primary colors and basic shapes like squares and red and blue is that all of these aspects, this visual aspect of squares and primary colors, is always that which is presupposed in every visual representation in art. Like you can't get behind or beyond the primary colors and the squares.
Hmm.
Whatever visual image you can create or you can see always presupposes these things. And in a similar fashion, you can't get beyond revelation.
Hmm.
It's that which you assume in every act of the intellect, in every act of the imagination, every visual perception you see in the world. You're always in contact with the good and true and the beautiful in some way. So that's what we're trying to communicate there.
And can you talk a little bit? So we talked a little bit about the general and special, natural, supernatural. Um, what about this idea of coming forward from hiddenness?
Coming forward from hiddenness. Yeah. So it's making explicit the implicit, I suppose. And, the primary colors and the lines are always implicit and they're presupposed. They're the preconditions for visual representation in a way. And I think that's what Bavinck is trying to say here with respect to the philosophy of revelation, is trying to investigate that which was implicit in everyone's imagination. We talk about Charles Taylor's social imagination or plausibility structures, whatever else. Revelation provides the conditions for that. It's what makes sense of that. It's why we can't eradicate the sense of divinity, the sense of the good and true and the beautiful. So what he's going to try to argue is that if you tether this implicit contact with general revelation with special revelation, you're going to end up seeing and inhabiting a more capacious imagination where all things are seen in all of their diversity, all things are seen in all their richness and complexity. And actually, when you are trying to not connect the sense of the good and true and the beautiful with God, with special revelation and so on, you're always going to end up with a kind of reductionist sort of worldview or reductionist sort of imagination. So whether this is, he has two poles throughout the book are always between what he calls mechanical thinking, which is really scientific naturalism, the reduction of all things to matter and their physical components, and then what he calls dynamic vitalism, which is a kind of pantheistic, idealist sort of movement, which reduces all things to the absolute or the divine in some way, in a kind of univocal way. Not that the divine is something beyond us, but rather the divine is something immanent. And he's trying to say that if you go with connecting the good and true and the beautiful with the Christian God, you're actually going to be able to do justice to the physicality of all things and also the way in which all things are really traces of the creator. So there's a kind of unity and diversity because all things come from the triune God. Anyway, so that's making implicit the explicit in a proper way, because we can make the implicit and tether the implicit to something that is only physical or something that is only spiritual. But he wants to tether it to something both physical and spiritual, something creational, in other words.
Yeah, as I was going through that, I haven't read Bavinck, but I got my master's in philosophy of religion, and all of a sudden Van Til and Plantinga, I was like, oh, I'm very familiar with these ideas. Can you talk a little bit about Bavinck's legacy and where we see him kind of his stuff pop up? I think you give like 3 or 4 like clear paths or trails.
That's right. Yeah. So these are all contested waters. All the Plantingians are contesting all these things, and we had Nick Wolterstorff on our Grace in Common podcast, and we talked about a little bit of that as well. And the Van Til legacy with respect to Herman Bavinck is also very much contested and all that. But you can see trajectories that come from the neo-Calvinist tradition or Bavinck and Kuyper. And what we see, for instance, in Plantinga and Wolterstorff is the instincts that you cannot separate your Christian identity from your philosophical thinking. So Plantinga's famous address is, advice to Christian philosophers, and he argues that you don't have to be on the defensive all the time. You don't need to justify starting from Christian foundations and Christian starting points to do your philosophy. You can just start as a Christian. You can draw from all that information that you know as a Christian from the Bible about the Holy Spirit, about Jesus and creation and so on, without feeling like you need to demonstrate it beforehand. And I think that's a very neo-Calvinist instinct, right? And Bavinck goes on and just doesn't really need to feel that he needs to prove by reason alone first that there is a God before we can talk about God, but rather he's showing inductively that Christian revelation is inescapable, and he's writing from a explicitly Christian point of view. And Nick Wolterstorff and all of his work on justice, on aesthetics, on liturgy, on the imagination, and so on, all of these works come from his understanding that Christianity is holistic. And so, whether you're talking about Wolterstorff, Plantinga, or Van Til, all of them have this idea that Christianity provides us with holistic foundations. You can address any topic from a Christian perspective. I will say that Van Til is probably a lot more deductive than inductive in the way that he
Yes.
argues for it. What I say to my students is that sometimes you got to read Van Til like the book of Leviticus. There are going to be lines that are going to be like, I have no idea what he means by this or that, and it seems that he's jumping the gun, but get the kernel, get the good, and once you get the kernel, it does open up for you. I had to revisit Van Til because I had to teach the history of apologetics here, for instance, and he would make some judgments. He also writes in conclusions rather than argues for those conclusions. So you got to be charitable to him. You got to be really patient with the guy. So yeah, so those are just a couple of trajectories. We can also talk about, Richard Mao. We can also talk about Herman Bavinck, and all of these are contested waters. And what we try to do with Bavinck and the recovery of Bavinckian texts is that you got to go back to the primary sources and not just read these second, third generation permutations.
Mm. Yeah, I'm just glad that you said Doyeweerd before I had to, so then I knew how to pronounce it.
Yeah,
that's a name and a half.
that is definitely.
As we work through, and this is something that kind of comes up, part of this rejection of just straight reasoning comes from this historical process.
Right.
What is the value, and how does that change the method by viewing revelation as this historical process rather than kind of this enlightenment, like reason first?
One of the things that I think we're starting to see now is, well, if you've been to a Reformed seminary, at least in North America, you would have been acquainted with a theologian by the name of Gerhardus Voss. So Gerhardus Voss is the so-called father of modern biblical theology. And what he tries to argue is that when you're talking about the Bible, you're not just looking at, propositions in the abstract that leads you to other propositions, but rather you're looking at what he calls the organic unfolding of the history of redemption. And so what you see is that the Old Testament, he would argue, is a kind of like a seed that slowly flowers and matures into the full-blown oak tree in the New Testament. And so there's a broad historical continuity between the Old Testament and the New Testament, with the same gospel message of redemption tethered throughout that ultimately climaxes in the coming and revelation of Jesus Christ. And Voss got that from a lot of different instincts. And I would argue, well, there's J.P. Gabler, and then, of course, the neo-Calvinist tradition before Voss, which is in Bavinck and Kuyper, which really took up this idea of the organic from the Bible itself, I would argue, but also inspired by the romantic movements around them, as we talked about, that saw organic language as really helpful in showing us the connectivity of all human nature throughout time. So I think, when you read the previous,
I apologize. Do you mind explaining more on that, what you just said about the organic land, like.
Yeah, so the organic language. Okay, this is again a huge swath of literature behind this.
It's academics. Like, of course, people are
Right.
going to contest it. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you take a look at the 19th century, organic language is really quite ubiquitous. So whether you're reading Friedrich Schleiermacher, Schelling, even a little bit of Hegel, you're going to see organic language pop up. And organic language refers to, basically by these authors, something about the unity of human nature, the unity of human beings across time, the unity of history, the developmental aspect of history. Even in some authors, the unity between God and the world. So God and the world are in a kind of organic relation. And to contextualize for their readers and listeners, Bavinck and Abraham Kuyper, the two Dutch neo-Calvinists we're talking about here, would use organic language as well, but they strictly redefined it in light of the Bible. And they would argue God is being. God does not change. God is simple. God is absolute. God is absolutely distinct from creation, but creation is revelational of God, or is a kind of analog of God's being. And because God is absolute unity and diversity in his triune self, creation will also mirror God by disclosing aspects of unities and diversities. So history is an organism. It does develop in some way, but it doesn't mean that God's life develops. Human nature is an organism. There's a unity and diversity, but that unity is not found in some German culture, which is the teleological aspect of history, but rather that unity is found in Adam or in Jesus, our covenantal representatives. So if Jesus Christ represents you, you belong to him as your head. And so you are his body and he is your head. So they're really redefining the organic in light of the organic language of the Bible. So when people say to me, well, that organic worldview stuff, that's all just German idealism. Well, no, the Bible is where we get the definitions first. And there's a formal similarity with German idealism, but we're going to redefine it in light of the Bible. So in the Bible, you see organic language. You see, for instance, that the Old and New Testaments have the same substance, but different forms across time. Or in classical language, it's one single covenant of grace in different administrations. The Abrahamic administration is different than the New Covenant, but it's a single covenant of grace, right? And so organic language has that idea of there's that essence of history moving along, but history moves in its different forms. And you can interpret that in light of covenant theology. You can also interpret that in light of the organic language, and interpret that in light of the union that we have with Christ and so on. So because they were more attuned to the 19th century historical turn, this turn to history as a source of knowing and as a way of contextualizing and conditioning your knowing. Because you're romantics, you understood that the way you know is not by abstract reason, but by a conditioned space and time. You understood that we have to understand the Bible in light of its redemptive historical character. And you also understood that revelation has been received by the church across time and space. So you're more aware of the development of doctrine, and you're more aware of the development of the reception of revelation. I don't know if that's answering your question. I forgot it.
No, it's a
Historical method.
Yes, yeah. As we talk about organic language, you mentioned quite a bit. I think like kind of Pauline language, the systematic language. Would it be also fair to point to things, and this shows up in Paul as well, kind of the consistent use of plant language to describe the way that Revelation shows up, or the way that the church develops, right? It's like you have a vine or you have an olive tree, and then you get grafted in. And that's obviously a process, right?
Right. That's exactly right. So, the church, and this is one of the things that attracted me to Herman Bavinck initially as well, is that the church is going to look really different across time and space. And that no one expression of the church, he would argue, is the golden age, or is the golden manifestation of what the church is. Well, behind this is also his idea. He's an amillennial, which means that there is no progressive advancement of the kingdom of God until the return of Jesus Christ. And so he's going to argue that, whether the church looks like the church in Geneva in the 16th century or the church in the Netherlands in the 19th century, we're not going to isolate that one era or one form of the church with the true church. But rather, the church can look very different in different spaces and times. And that's okay, because culture, in a way, is not absolute. Not that it's all completely just relativistic, but rather, you know, when you take a look at two Christian families, one Christian family looks like this and the other Christian family looks like that. They're all imitating Christ. Or what Bavinck would say is that, Peter looks like Peter and John looks like John. And Peter is brash and action-minded. John is contemplative. That's the stereotype, right? The apostles, I mean. And Christ never tells Peter, Peter, follow me the way John follows me, nor vice versa. There's room for individuality, personality. And if you extend that, there's room for cultures, different cultures to manifest themselves within the one Christian church. So, coming as a third culture kid who grew up in Singapore, Jakarta, and then now I'm in the States, I really appreciated that. And I think if you can just recover that sense of that distinction between, Christianity in its different cultural forms and the essence of Christianity, which is imitation of Christ, the kingdom of God, forgiveness, redemption, the gospel, and so on. I think we could do a lot of good, because I think a lot of our debates these days, a lot of our heated debates that I see, are really about cultural differences, not so much about theological differences. And I think we gotta be able to distinguish those two things and say that church looks different from mine, but we're all actually theologically the same. And so maybe my discomfort with that church is not really theological, but cultural.
I want to come back to that. Uh, but first, I wanted to ask, am I right in reading a little bit when we talk about this emphasis on development? Part of that is a very strong Protestant sensibility of like, oh, we can't talk about the age of Augustine and Constantine as this golden age of the church, right? Which is a very like, so there's a little bit of a Protestant like, no. It's been developing and it's always been good, and there's not one like golden age, which can sometimes happen with certain Roman Catholic manifestations. Is that a fair reading of Bavinck?
I mean, I would like to say it's a fair reading of Bavinck, and I would like to say it's a fair reading of Protestantism as well. And he's got this essay called "The Future of Calvinism," where he argues exactly that, where he says, Protestantism has always made room for cultural pluriformity, cultural individuality and expression. So when you take a look at the three forms of unity of the Netherlands, they're not exactly the same in its emphases, but it's the same in substance, sure, but not the same in emphases and context with the Westminster Standards. And the Lutheran catechisms don't look exactly the same as the Genevan. And we can talk about all of the different ways in which the Reformation, therefore, permeated the different countries, and yet we don't look for uniformity. We look for a kind of, again, unity and diversity. And so that's what the Christian worldview gives you, so that, when you take a look at Christianity as it develops in America versus the Netherlands, Bavinck would also say it's quite different in America. But why should we expect the Americans to look like Dutch Christianity? Neither is better, he would argue. And that's really refreshing to hear. And I think that's the sort of, again, sensitivity to historical context and the historical development of the reception of revelation. I think what happened in the 19th, 20th century that we can indeed learn from. And, I don't believe in a purely decline narrative. Of course, some things were worse theologically, blah, blah, blah. But, one of the things that Bavinck Kuiper learned, and Bavinck notes this all the time in his address, for instance, Orthodoxy and Modernism, that he wrote in 1911, he argued, what we learn now is that cultures are really very diverse, and the world is way bigger than we understood it to be, and what we took to be purely common sense were actually outdated by after 30 years or so of scientific advancements. What we thought was just intuition and intuitive is really just Dutch intuition. And when we took a look at the world history, people really generally are different from us. We got to wrestle with globalization and pluralization. And how can Christianity still make sense in this world? And I think they were trying to address that particular problem. So I don't think it's sufficient or persuasive to just say, well, Christianity is just uniform. But I think this impulse of organic unity and diversity is really quite healthy for the church to inculcate. Not that there is a singular point of human history where we're all developing towards, but rather all of us are organically united, but there's a diversity of cultures and forms.
Uh, do you mind sharing a little bit about your own personal journey through that? Because I think if anyone, it sounds like, I mean, you had quite the journey yourself, and that's part of the reason this appeals to you. What are some specific contemporary issues that you saw where you felt the need to distinguish between cultural issues and theological issues
Yeah. Well, you
without
know,
trying to get you into trouble? Yeah.
right. Well, after I did my PhD, I was a pastor for about 5 years in Jakarta, and that's where I grew up. I grew up in Singapore as well, and ministering in that context was just really, really quite different. One of the things that I saw, for instance, that was really needed in Indonesia was a lot of teaching and discipline and catechizing with respect to the family. And you would think, okay, that's interesting. Why the family? I thought that's what's needed in America. But the family, in the sense of overreaching authority of the oldest patriarch in the broader family, was a real issue in Indonesia. So very common, you have the oldest member of the family, let's say as a great grandfather who's still alive, maybe perhaps already cognitively in decline, but he's still calling the shots of where his granddaughters went to school and who you married and so on. And oftentimes a lot of that is also very racially tinged. You're not allowed to marry a foreigner. You're not allowed to marry somebody outside of your own race. And one of the things that Christianity did in the early church was actually diversify that sort of understanding, in the sense of, oh, it doesn't matter whether you're Greek or Jew. What matters is that you're a Christian first. Your Greek and Jewish identity are secondary. But in a context like Jakarta, where Chinese and Indonesians were really very much segregated from one another in a lot of ways, that's a sort of teaching that we need to recover. And it's actually something that we take for granted in the context of the West, this sort of individualism, which is kind of parasitic on the Christian understanding. Um, but that's something that we had to wrestle with. So again, it's just very different cultural emphases. And so I remember hearing about this one American preacher who talked to a group of fathers in the context of a conference for fathers, or a fathers retreat, or a fathers talk. I can't remember exactly. And his emphasis was discipline your children. And I'm like, well, you don't really need that. That's not exactly the sort of teaching that you shouldn't encourage more discipline of your children. You should, so the things that Western Christians are oftentimes scared of, individuality, freedom of conscience, freedom, liberty, and things like that, I actually found to be liberating, precisely because I think all of these things are permutations of the Christian faith. Can they be taken away and ripped apart from the Christian faith? Yes. And of course, we see that in secularization in the West. But these are good things that I wanted to emphasize in my own ministry in the context of Indonesia, not because they're Western things, but because they are Christian ideals first. And another thing that I found was, for instance, in the context of Jakarta, when you're ministering there, the temptation is actually to be more harsh than you need to be when you're addressing issues like sexual ethics. Because in the context of Jakarta, where Islam is a huge influence, for instance, and Chinese Confucianism is a huge influence as well, when you are, let's say, having sex before marriage, that's not just a sin, that's taboo. It's not just, an individual mark of error, but it's also something that's going to bring shame to your whole family. So the church would look incredibly, quote unquote, liberal there, because we were going to say, oh, you were engaged in that sort of relationship. Forgiveness is here in Jesus Christ, and you can be immediately forgiven. Of course, there's discipleship process, repentance, and so on, But, the Christian sexual ethic is not seen to be outrageous in the East. It's natural law. But it's not just natural law. It's also so incredibly legalistic there that you got to emphasize the forgiveness and liberation that comes after you become a Christian. So that's really useful apologetically in the West, because you can tell people, people are quibbling with not just quibbling, rejecting the Christian sexual ethic. as if everybody's going to reject them. No, it's actually a point of contact in the East. So anyway, the preaching, therefore, looks very different, right? You got to contextualize. The preaching in the East, you don't have to give an apologetic for the Christian sexual ethic. Everybody assumes it. But in the West, you got to give an apologetic for that. And so I think if you're an Indonesian coming to a church in New York City or Los Angeles, you might be thinking like, why are they spending all this time on Christian sexual ethics? Like, let's just get to like what really is important. Family issues, you know what I mean?
Right.
Whatever. And you can start, and if you don't have this idea of the Catholicity or the universality, the organic character of the church, you're going to be like, this church is really unorthodox because you're always preaching on this issue that really is not that important, you know. But that's not a theological difference. That's a cultural difference in the sense of contextualizing, you know. So I think that sort of sensitivity, and I tell people it's a real privilege to be able to travel, but do travel, because you're starting to realize that things that you take for granted are not to be taken for granted. And okay, here's probably another thing, and Tim Keller emphasizes this a lot, but the two-party system in America is really quite complicated in terms of the Christian faith, right? Where some Christians would say you have to be a Democrat or else you can't really be a Christian because we care about justice, or you have to be a Republican or else you're not really Christian because we care about abortion or sexual ethics and so on. And there's grains of truth, but you can't think of a one package system because all you have to do is just move to a place like Indonesia, and the options are just completely different. And which one is the Christian option, quote unquote Christian option? I think that's really difficult.
Yeah, I've felt that considerably when you talked about the failure of that American pastor. I was a youth sponsor for kind of classic. It was Upper Wisconsin, so it was very, very white church. The whole population up there is white, and so I did this lesson that was very well received and very helpful on how collective guilt works with Adam. Why are we responsible for Adam's sin? And the kids really liked it. And then when I went to go get my master's in philosophy of religion in Deerfield, Illinois, I was a youth pastor at a Korean church, and I did the whole lesson again on collective guilt. And they were listening. And I got to the end, and I was like, "So what do you think? Like, I mean, isn't that helpful?" And they're like, "No, that's really obvious. Like, of course, of course, we're responsible for our families.
Yep.
Like, our family." I was like, "Oh,
that's right." And in that context, the collective guilt definitely is a huge assumption in Indonesia as well. I want more individuality.
Right.
I want more personality. I don't want uniformity because uniformity is all we have there. I mean, it's very common there. If you went to a Batak wedding, I use this example in class. A Batak wedding is they're a particular they're Indonesians, but they're a particular tribe within Indonesia. And you go to a Batak wedding, it's very different culturally from a normal Jakartan wedding. But they really believe in collective guilt, and they know your last name. They know what your family did 4 generations ago, and they're not even going to befriend you because they know that there's this infighting between the X family versus the Y family like 4 centuries ago. And I'm like, the gospel can bring so much redemption to that, but I don't have to justify our federal unity with Adam.
Right.
So when I read these, modern theologians who say things like, it's so unjust for us to be held accountable for Adam, I'm like, no, man, you're just westernized. You gotta just zoom out a little bit. This is not just common sensely unjust. Yeah. So great point.
So I want to be respectful of your time. Is there? So if I could ask you just 2 more questions. One is you talked about this inductive study. Bavinck goes to these different subjects. Is there one in particular that you found helpful, or is there one that's like your favorite to talk about?
Yeah, I think it would probably be the last chapter, Revelation in the Future. I'm editing this Essential Bavinck reader. It's really, really hard to narrow down, what quote unquote is essential Bavinck. But I selected a few pieces from the philosophy of Revelation, and this section of Revelation in the Future is really quite potent because he's dealing with eugenicism. And we now think, obviously, eugenicism is wrong, but this was all the rage in the 1900s. So, and he traces it again to this sense of the good and the true and the beautiful that we have in every single person. And because we've gotten rid of the transcendent, the hope for the future has to be this worldly, he argues at the very beginning of the chapter. And if there's no God, then humans must liberate themselves. Well, how will we liberate ourselves? Well, through scientific progress, technological progress. Now, if we know that humanity has evolved through biological evolution, why can't we also artificially evolve by way of, let's just advance it even further by manipulating humanity self-consciously through our will rather than just by nature. And eugenicism seemed like a very logical option. And what he actually argued is that this is the result of not locating the sense of the good in God. And when God is not your transcendent good, you're always going to identify something within creation itself as the transcendent good. And again, it's going to be your humanity. And because you're going to prefer your own culture, you're going to identify your culture as the greatest good. And that would lead to racism, eugenicism, and nationalism, he argued. I think that's the best argument there. And what,
because it was
he's
predictive,
really,
like you said
it was
earlier.
very predictive.
Yes.
And in fact, I think very potent because it's really quite true that humanity has a longing for a better future, a better society. And eugenicism was a way of solving our sense that we've deviated from the good. And it's a way of trying to reground the telos in something outside of God. So I put it kind of controversially in a lecture essay. If you depart from Christianity, racism, eugenicism is happening. And that's Bavinck's arguments. But he didn't just say that like I did. He shows it from all these different German philosophers and sometimes British philosophers arguing for that as well.
Yeah, and that's I'm frustrated because I wanted to. There it is. There's the number. I was trying to find the number for it because I remember the first time where the school that I went to, kind of like rah American history, right? North America, this stuff happens, and I remember the first time I found out in the 1920s that you had 70,000 forced sterilizations.
Right.
In North America, and we always want to talk about like the racist Nazis, but eugenics was eugenics was the way to go. Like that was the educated opinion of the time.
Right. And everybody was saying this is the way of the future and so on. And if you just zoom out a little bit, how silly that claim is. And I think we can also probably think about, okay, what are the so-called scientific consensus or that issue? You're probably going to see in 50, 60 years things that we've recognized now as something good, but in the future we're going to be like, what are we doing? What are we thinking?
Yeah,
this was not just stupid; it was also quite evil. And I think we can probably predict some of them even today.
So final question. This is the typical question I ask my guests. Besides reading Bavinck's Philosophy of Revelation, what would you have our audience walk away with today to kind of chew on, to meditate throughout the week after listening to this episode?
Yeah, great. Thank you. If you're a Christian, try hard to really make that distinction between theological orthodoxy and cultural differences. I'm probably just speaking from the reform world, but I think so much of what we are fighting over oftentimes are cultural differences and not so much theological differences, or what Tim Keller calls, theological vision. So Tim Keller in his book Center Church would distinguish between your doctrinal foundation, your theological vision, and then your ministry expression. And he says, why is it that in the context of, let's say, the Reformed churches, who all have the same confession, Westminster Standards, but our ministry expressions look really different from one Reformed church to another, even one Presbyterian church to another? Well, he argues the differences are really not about, sometimes it is, and you got to really deal with it, not about doctrinal foundation, but really about theological vision, which is your articulation, or maybe not articulated or not articulated viewpoint of how your doctrine should be translated to your ministry expression. what should we emphasize? How do we contextualize? And theological vision is really about contextualization. I think if you're not a Christian here, everybody is a sinner, and nobody is better than anyone else. And everybody, because they're a sinner, needs forgiveness and redemption. And that redemption can only be found in the person of Jesus Christ, who lived the righteous life that you should have lived and died the death that you should have died. And only because he resurrected from the dead can you have assurance that you would be accepted by God, because his righteousness is offered to you in the gospel. So because you sinned, you cannot be made right with God. But because he was righteous, you could be made right with God, because God will now consider you in him. And his righteousness is now yours, given to you freely. It's good news, not good advice. And if you're not a Christian, let me say one more thing. You are always going to, because I also know this, and when I lived as an atheist until I became a Christian when I was 17. You too have a vision of the good and the true and the beautiful. You might say, I don't really care about the good, or good is all relative, but you believe that there's something good. And if that good is not grounded in God, not identified with God, you're going to end up locating that good in something else. And I want to challenge you to think about what that good is for you and why that good is absolute for you. And if you're saying, well, nothing is absolute, everything is relative, even that becomes sort of an absolute statement. Maybe that's pretty rudimentary, but I want to challenge you to identify what it is that you're identifying your goodness in. What is the longing that you're rooting yourself into? What's your identity? And if that's not found in God, then you're going to end up projecting it to other people, and it's going to look really tyrannical. And if it's not grounded in God, it's going to be really, really fleeting and insecure, because everybody feels like there's something wrong with them, and they've got to find something good outside of them. And I want to challenge you to find that in God.
Dr. Sutanto, thank you for that final charge, and thank you so much for coming on today. Really appreciated it.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.